Stretch is similar to first-year writing classes in that traditionally it was a one-semester course, and in one semester you had to learn all your basic reading, critical thinking, and comprehension skills within 15 weeks. What Stretch allows students to do is to refine those skills and work more detailed and more expanded over the course of 2 semesters.
The Stretch program is a program that addresses multiculturalism and diversity, and that allows different departments such as Asian American Studies and Pan-African Studies, the English department, Chicano Studies, Central American Studies, Queer Studies, to pour content that is specific to the issues that, or to the area of studies that each of the departments explores.
Stretch is, I'm going to say, an outgrowth of remedial writing and not a replacement for. The difference now with the Stretch program is that previously students did not receive college credit for all the work that they did, and now they receive anywhere from 6 to 8 units that apply towards graduation.
I don't see it so much as a replacement, but as a different way of thinking about writing and composition, that we're sort of getting rid of the idea of remediation or that students are remedial, and recognizing that students bring all kinds of skills and talents and interests and abilities, including writing and linguistic, to our programs, and how they can use these, show off what they do well, also build on their skills, get the support they need. And so I think rather than thinking of students as coming with a deficit, we think of them as coming already with ideas and skills that they can refine and use and build upon.
We hope to blend rhetorical studies with our understanding of socio-economic, cultural, and historical processes that have influenced our culture. And that's the way we look at it. So when we teach Stretch, we are not deviating from the rhetorical processes themselves. What we do is we bring in cultural materials to demonstrate or to manifest various areas of the rhetorical process itself.
Another thing that I think is important in Chicano studies is that we teach content. So the idea is that we teach students something about their culture in those classes. And even for, non-Chicanos or non-Latinos, that's still a part of like this identity, kind of the politics of identity. So that's what I've always done, is I've always sort of like thought about the content that I'm teaching alongside the writing, right? The technical parts of writing, developing a thesis statement, using commas, blah, blah, blah. So content has always been like really important, I think, to our department.
I think it's thinking about the ways in which gender and sexuality are constructed rhetorically in language, visually, and also the intersections among gender, sexuality, race, class, age, and other categories of identity. So it's, there's a commitment to diversity. And to me, these things are all informed by rhetoric, because you can't really have culture or identity without thinking about representations of culture and identity, responses to culture and identity, writing about culture and identity. So I don't really see a separation between the rhetoric and the cultural studies focus of our courses, but that we're really looking at how the one informs and is constructed by the other.
Stretch composition courses in Central American Studies are designed to help students develop critical thinking, writing, and reading skills. However, grammar is not taught in isolation. We practice the rules according to the material that we read. So in our program, students learn to write while at the same time they acquire a better understanding of the complexities, historical complexities of the Central American region and culture, as well as the different ethnicities that represent Central America and the different worldviews within that community.
I would say the progressions and the way in which they allow us as instructors to scaffold our curriculum really well, and also the way that the smaller exercises lead up to the larger essays help the students see this overall cohesion to the course and to really build upon these skills that they learn throughout the semester.
The approach that Asian American Studies takes to first-year writing is very similar in curriculum and structure as the English department, Pan-African Studies, Queer Studies, Central American Studies, and Chicano Studies. The only approach that might be different is some of the texts that we use focus on Asian American issues or Asian themes. Progressions are a series, there's 3 progressions, 1, 2, and 3. Within each progression, there's a series of 3 writing assignments. And those writing assignments can culminate either in an essay, a traditional essay, or can be carried over. Some teachers might do it the first semester, but carried over to the second semester to become the material for project medium, project space, and project text. So that the work we ask students to do in progressions 1, 2, and 3 is producing material that they can use to create complete larger assignments like project space, project medium, and project text.
Since it's the first actual project, I would say, that we're doing in this semester, I do more focus on actually summarizing what is being read, because what I really want them to do is get the content and start understanding that so much of what they are used to doing is skimming. Like, they'll read something and then 2 seconds later they're, oh, I'm done, and then you ask them what it's about and they are not really sure. So I really like to focus on the actual summary. So tell me exactly what was it about? Were there any main people in the story or in the article? Anything that stands out to you? Anything you think is important?
Normally what I want the students to sort of really glean from this idea of summary is, well, how are you understanding it? And in understanding and summarizing a text, right, you're learning to sort of understand what you're understanding from the text, but at the same time, you're also learning to sort of think about the topic itself. So in that way, you're sort of doing invention, right? Because you're responding to the text in a certain way. It's not just summarizing what the writer said, but also summarizing what you, as a student, is learning from the text.
We do focus on invention, but we always use passages from cultural areas of our discipline. For example, we have used Cornel West's, some of his works that he has been well known for. And we use passages from some of those books to give the students a sense of an understanding of the issues that confront a particular race of people. But at the same time, we want them to be able to summarize what is it that they're reading. So in a sense, to have that personal relationship with the content and the process as well.
Critical reading is a really essential component for Progression 1. And the way that I introduce critical reading is to have the students read different genres. So teaching them some basic skills of critical reading, but then also showing them how those skills can function in different genres, I found really helps them grasp exactly what critical reading is and how to conduct it on their own.
We use Alice Walker, for example, and the slave narratives, which have been very, very poignant in terms of teaching students how history intersects, with culture and writing.
One of the best ways to sort of really interact with the text is just sort of marking the places that you first connect with, right? I don't want them to stress out about, oh, you have to do this, you have to do that, but rather try to connect with the text. I think that's the best way to really learn how to critically read. Mark the things that you don't understand. Mark the things that maybe seems important for you, but at this point in time, you're not sure, right? Why does it seem important? And I give them a chance to sort of just immerse themselves, get into conversation with the text. In the classroom, we talk about their different ideas, their different questions. And I think that's the best way to really engage them in critical reading, is just sort of asking questions of the text. And every semester, I always use different texts. Sometimes I'll use theoretical texts if I have to, but there are times when I'll just use, regular novels. Like this semester, we use Jessica Hagedorn's Dog Eaters, which is a very, very hard text. It's postmodern, and it's set in Manila, Philippines. So it's a different time and place too. It's set during when the Philippines was under martial law. So it was a hard read, but what was great about it was the students sort of really had to dig really deep to create some sort of understanding, and I think that all the questions we asked of the text is what really engaged them in this notion of critical reading. Well, one of the most important things for me about those letters is for the students to understand this notion of audience awareness. The notion that depending on who your audience is, your writing changes, your voice changes. So one of the things we do is we do a rhetorical exercise that makes them understand how different people adjust to different audiences, and we do exercises where they realize that they change their voice whenever they're addressing a different audience, so that when they get to the letters, they see those changes, and hopefully that will sort of get reiterated once they move on to their essay.
That's why the common reading makes sort of a beautiful kind of like pairing, right, with what's going on in the stretch. And I'm not sure if that was intentional when you guys were developing it. But I did actually use the letter to the writer. They were just, they exploded. I mean, they just were, just telling her, writing to her, because she was a real person, and we got to see YouTube videos of her doing various kinds of interviews. And so for her, she was real. She wasn't this kind of imaginary sort of dead person, right? Or dead writer. She was there, she was alive. And what's really wonderful about her is she's also an English teacher. So we actually looked at this really old video of her giving advice to first-year writers. And so that made her even better, even more attractive, because they felt like they could write to her and get advice with their own writing.
The histories that we know are through letters. So I introduce the importance of letters to Black people throughout history, and then give them examples, and then talk about the importance of letter writing not only for themselves but their future. Because every time they send a resume out, or every time they send a packet of information for a scholarship, they're going to have to know how to write a letter. So I really give them the historical aspect in terms of how important it's been to African people in the past, but then also show how important it is to their future.
We do letters to friends and families. I've had a couple students actually write letters to their boyfriends or to their grandmas, which is still family, but the boyfriend ones are always interesting. But basically, the way I approach it is to have them, again, read over specific, whatever readings we have for that class. And then, again, take out what are the main points here, because again, I really want them to focus on understanding and starting to kind of plant little seeds for critical thinking and all that kind of stuff. So even in these very kind of informal pieces of writing, have them really think, well, what is the message that you're really trying to convey to your mom? So let's say they're writing a letter that says, hey mom, I'm in my first semester, I live at the dorms, and it really sucks. I'm in this class, and I've been reading about Central Americans and different ethnicities. And so then, aside from just stopping there, just what's important about that for your mom to know. So then they start discussing, well, for example, we're Central American, and I never knew that there was this ethnicity and this ethnicity and this ethnicity. And so that kind of gets them thinking more than just, dear mom, I'm away, I'm in this class, I hate it, blah, blah, blah. And then you just kind of get them to really, again, focus on the interesting, the important points of the readings and convey that in an informal manner.
Peer review for some of our students is a challenge. The reason is they haven't done something like this before. Basically, what you're asking them to do is to critique each other's work. And you have to give them the skills of critiquing in order for them to do a good job of it.
We do peer review in the classes. I have a sheet that's pre-made. So essentially, I give it to each one and then have them exchange their papers and then have them go through and literally answer each question on the sheet according to whatever the other person has written. And then by the end of the second semester, they're pretty much got it, and they get really good at peer review because they have to use the sheet every time. And so I think it works out pretty nicely.
So the way I introduce peer review is that, you're being responsible for your own learning, right? That you are joining this community of scholars and that you guys are supposed to be hearing each other's voices and being responsible for responding to each other. And so for me, peer review is, I tell the students, you have this guide sheet, but at the same time, you have your own instinct about what's good writing or not, what's something you're understanding or not. So I introduce peer review as a chance for them to sort of be able to express their own agency as students.
The first time they do it, they're very hesitant because they don't want to hurt their fellow classmates' feelings. But I let them know that that's actually part of this critique of love that we call it. The things that they offer them that are going to help the student, then that is what's important and that's what they should try to do.
Because we've been kind of building up to this point, we've been reading different articles. We have written letters that kind of help explain in an informal way what the articles are about. By the time we get to the essay, they have kind of different perspectives that they've used to look at these articles. And so the essay just kind of freely flows from that. Essentially, we just take what you've learned from the letters, take the things that you learned from the summary, and now you're going to write a little essay about what the meaning of these articles are or what you got from these articles. So I think the progressions really help just easily get to the essay, has been my experience.
It was an opportunity for us to really apply the African-centered approach that we use, because African people have always used images to speak, whether it be Meta-Nature or hieroglyphics from ancient Egypt, which I introduced my students to, or whether it be Adinkra symbols in West Africa that they were also introduced to. They got to really understand how symbols are very important to African life and history. So we discussed that first, and then I showed them some images, anywhere from the lynching picture of Emmett Till to the 1968 Black Power salute at the Mexico Olympics. And I showed them different images of Black people throughout history and asked them to analyze it and discuss how that represents or is a snapshot of the history of Black people. And then they were allowed to bring in their own images that support themselves and represent who they are, and then also images that represent Black people that they felt were also representative and spoke volumes through the images.
One of the things that we do is bring a visual object into class. And then based on that visual object, we're going to analyze the object and what it means to you, and then write based on that. So that's a really fun project, because what we do in Central American Studies is ask them to bring an object that relates to their identity in some way. And a lot of the times the object ends up having a lot of meaning in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, which is all tied into their identity. So, for example, one of the things that a student brought in, which I'll show you, this is not the actual thing that she brought in, but she brought in an apron. And the apron represented for her grandmother, and so it represented her history, she said. It represented kind of the foods. It brought very familial aspects into the picture, her culture, her family, And then the way it was decorated, she felt really represented her nationality.
In my second progression in my queer studies stretch course, we looked at visual representations of queer people. So we thought about the way queerness is constructed. We looked at the documentary film The Celluloid Closet to see a history of Hollywood representations of queer people. We thought about linguistic constructions of queer people. We did analysis both of visual constructions and linguistic constructions. And so to me, that's also thinking about rhetoric at the same time that we're thinking about culture representation.
Another assignment that we did was, it was a little write-up. It was like a creative writing on a picture we chose of our choice from the internet. The one I chose is of two lovers in the snow, in a snowy forest. They embrace each other cautiously because they seem to be very careful about the relationship. They don't want to be caught, it seems. This was a story I wrote from what I felt of from the picture of what I chose.
With the ethnography, I had the students first understand the part of oral tradition within African life and culture, and explained how important that is for the stories to be for interviews and observations to be part of that, because there's a lot of things we haven't documented that we could have or should have or need to. So I introduced the importance of ethnography and the oral tradition and observation to the students first, and then I let them go and observe different places, and within that I actually added a piece of interviews. So they were supposed to go to this particular place, observe, and ask them 5 questions, 5 people, 5 questions. And my students said that was the one project they loved the best that semester, because it got them out of their comfort zone and forced them to have to talk to people that they would have never otherwise talked about.
What I think is really important about the ethnography exercise is that when you're talking about visual text, you want it to be based on something real. And when they do the ethnographic exercises, you know, they go out there and observe whatever it was, whatever concept it was that they originally had. Like, for example, with that exercise on this theme of community, if they were looking at some socio-political issue, they had to go out there and look for that space where they're going to be able to observe how that there's the interactions between people created this socio-political tension. Right. So, and I think that's what's important about the ethnographic studies, is sort of basing it on something real world.
It's been a little bit difficult for me and my students sometimes to think about how to use all of these progression exercises into the culminating essay for progression 2. So what I've done in the past is I've tried a number of different things. In one case, I gave students the option. I said, either develop your ethnography into the longer essay for progression 2, or analyze the image that you talked about in the first exercise, make that analysis the longer version, or even develop the creative writing piece.
While it's probably more descriptive than argumentative, I've always just told my students that whatever it is that they write is an argumentative essay, because even if it falls within the descriptive genre, they have an argument. There's an underlying argument in everything that they write. And so you should always just think of whatever it is that you're writing as some sort of argumentative piece.
The students are going to have to, throughout the course of their academic career, definitely going to have to write argumentative essays. I mean, they're going to have to take an approach, they're going to have to pick a topic, take an approach, and argue, whether it be in a debate class, whether it be in an English class or history class, they're going to have to interpret something in some particular way. So I let the students choose their own topics and then guided them, took them to the library so that they could learn how to gain get sources, which was pivotal for first-year students who've never really been to the library before. So teaching them how to get sources and resources was the first step. And then, of course, guiding them through the process, having them do a paper proposal was a great way to start with that, and giving them feedback, and then having them have rough drafts and being able to peer edit those. So it was very easy to introduce it to them, especially if I let them pick a topic they liked rather than assigning a topic to them, because then they were more passionate and they cared more about the paper.
For this, I have students watch 2 documentaries. One is Food Inc. and one is Bowling for Columbine. And what I do is I let them do what they will with it. And they have created conversations between them and their parents, talking about what food they eat, or, they've put themselves in the position of, Michael Moore and Charlton Heston from the film, and Bowling for Columbine. So they really take license with it, and I let them go free. I don't try to enforce anything other than be creative. Use this as a way of kind of understanding the material better.
I like to use argumentation because that is a skill that they're going to be using quite a bit in many of the other classes. When you're arguing for a particular position, regardless of whether it's history or sociology or psychology, we need to be able to give them that understanding that you don't just take a position, you have to be able to defend it and acknowledge that there are other views that are different from those that you have taken.
I do have formal lessons, and I've changed quite a bit in terms of the way I use research, and I've been influenced a lot by Rebecca Moore Howard and her work on the Citation Project, as well as my own experience teaching Stretch. And originally, I really wanted my students to use peer-reviewed articles that they found on their own and incorporate those articles in a sophisticated way into their own arguments. And I found that was very difficult for students to do successfully, and the results were not very good. Sometimes students were not able to understand the articles holistically, so they might take little quotes from the article that really ran against the grain of the article as a whole. And Rebecca Moore Howard calls this quote mining, where students sort of focus on little bits and pieces from the secondary sources, and then really, instead of thinking of the argument as a whole. And her research has also shown that a very high percentage of quotations from secondary sources come from the first page, which also suggests that students may not be reading the complete article. So when I found that wasn't working, what I then did is I worked with my students on secondary sources in class. So we all read the secondary sources together, and then I invited my students to use those secondary sources in their papers. And at the beginning I was reluctant to do that because I thought this doesn't encourage students to do their own independent research, but I found the results were far superior because we talked about the articles together in class. We also talked about successful ways of using outside resources, following They Say, I Say, and they were able to do a much better job of using the outside resources. So it comes at a cost. Students were not going to the library, looking up their own secondary sources and figuring out how to use them. But I think that they were using the sources that I gave them and that we talked about together much more effectively.
Of how valuable the Stretch course has been to them. And the reflective essay tends to, more or less crystallize that feeling also.
I think the informal essay or the reflective essay that we include in the portfolio is great because it gives the students a chance to just express what they think about their own writing, or maybe how they feel they've learned, what the value of their work has been, and at the same time also give feedback on the class, the writing class. And I always enjoy sort of reading, when students are more candid, when they're not afraid to say, oh, I enjoyed this professor, but I did have a hard time understanding this. Because it doesn't just help the student, but it helps me as an instructor too on what I should be doing, right, to help a student out.
What I really like about the portfolio is, and we got this idea from visual artists' portfolios, is giving students some agency so that they have some say in how their grade is determined. That it also encourages risk-taking, because what I tell my students is at the end of the semester you're going to choose some of your work to include in the portfolio. So in other words, you can leave something out if something didn't work, or if you're tired of something, you don't want to work on it anymore. So it encourages students to take risks in their writing, because they know that if something fails, it's not necessarily going to count against them in their grade. So my students get the choice of leaving something out of the portfolio. I mean, artists' portfolios are supposed to be provide the artist with an opportunity to represent their best work. And so that's what I want my students to do. And I think the other thing that's important about the portfolios assignment is that the student gets to decide which is their best work. So it also helps them to think about evaluation criteria and gets them to reflect on their own work. In other words, I resist telling students, well, I think you should put this in your portfolio, but rather encouraging students to reflect on what criteria they would use and how they will decide what to put in their final portfolio.
The portfolio is very important because it's a compilation of all of the students' work over the entire semester. We focus on the preface and the reflective letter as a way to develop a metacognitive awareness of the students' writing, but also to consider the audience who will be reading these portfolios. I also have my students pick 2 of their best essays out of the whole semester, and that way they're able to showcase their work and get a grade for the class.
I tell students, whenever you're taking a course that is in the humanities or even in the arts, that the portfolio plays a really important role, because it's not the same as taking a cumulative or comprehensive exam and just spitting out information. This is what I learned. You're showing how you've evolved as a writer, how you've grown. This is a representation of your best work. And when you approach it in that way, the students really understand just how important the portfolio is. And I find that they're eager to show off what they've learned, and they want the readers to see that they've developed in certain ways.
Because of the projects in the stretch curriculum, many of those project assignments do ask students to move away from inside of the classroom. Students are asked to do ethnographies, to speak with other people. In Project Space, students are asked to go out and to analyze public spaces, and sometimes personal spaces when they're within their own home in the places that they work. So they're definitely no longer just reading essays in a classroom or watching a video and writing about it, but they're required to go out and gather their own research, their own observations, and to speak with other people who may not even be in the class. And so definitely it breaks that classroom walls down, right? They have to move outside of it.
So for our project Web and Media, I introduced how Black people have used blogs, how they've made films, how they've used websites, and what's the purpose and function behind that historically and presently. I introduced the students to some Black filmmakers. I introduced the students to some famous Black bloggers, both here and throughout the diaspora, just to kind of get them in the mood to understand the purpose and function of what people have done before and presently. And then I actually let my students choose the media. So they could actually do blogs, they could create websites, they could make magazines, or they could make films. And the projects turned out better than I could have ever imagined, and I'm really happy that I allowed them the different forms of media. And what forced me to I had to go learn how to create all these forms of media so then I could help my students create these, because I wasn't going to allow them to try if I didn't try also. So I actually allowed them to do different forms, and it ended up being fantastic. Their creativity is amazing.
Technology has definitely changed the way we have taught composition in Asian American studies. Now we can analyze films, YouTube video clips, Facebook accounts, Twitter messages. Writing and text has gone beyond the traditional textbook or the novel or the poem. And it's happening in the classrooms now is that students are learning that also includes their writing assignments. One of the assignments is to produce a dialogue, which in essence is a script. And so students, instead of writing an essay on an issue, will write a script or a dialogue on an issue with 2 or 3 characters. And they end up taping that and making films and showing that text can be produced through a technology form like filming and then given to an audience. In an age where technology is shaping the way we think and giving us different formats in which to think and which to learn, I think that's added to the experience. And in Stretch, we acknowledge that in Project Web or Project Medium. Like, do a web page or a blog, you don't necessarily have to write an essay as being the only way to learn how to write.
In my class, what they did this semester, they actually created a newsletter about Project Space. And what they did that was really unique in my class, that they went out in the community. As you know, Project Space, it's an A and a B portion. The A portion, we talk about the community, especially in Los Angeles, and actually what they did in groups, they actually went out to the community and they interviewed people. They interviewed people how they utilize private and public space. And that was really beneficial for them.
I like to have my students do field work, but before I set them out to do that, we look at models. For instance, I used David Foster Wallace's essay, Ticket to the Fair, where he went to the Illinois State Fair for 3 days and kept a running diary of it. We also watch a mini documentary from the PBS Frontline series called Close to Home, where the producers observed a hair salon in the Upper East Side of Manhattan for a week. So they can see the different ways in which an ethnography and fieldwork should function, and that it's not merely about describing a space, but making observations and analyzing what those observations are.
But at this point, even though they don't notice it, they're addressing issues that theorists such as Deleuze discuss, for example, in terms of space, the diagramming of space, or Foucault discusses in terms of discipline and how space forces us to behave in certain ways. And so for us, it's wonderful that we have a program that allows us to apply all these ideas to the different contexts and the content that each one of the departments pours into the Stretch program.
I enjoy all of the projects. I think that's one of the beauties in the Stretch program, that we have the time to dedicate to each of them. However, the project text is one of my favorites. And in our program, we design it so that it's at the end. Students at that point are more comfortable with the material that they are reading. They are able to process, to think more critically about the themes presented to them. But one of the things I like in this project is that other than taking a very traditional literary approach to reading the text, we do a more interdisciplinary approach. And that means students first get to read the text. And for example, this year we are reading Manlio Argueta's One Day of Life. In the past, they have read Tattoo Soldier by Hector Tovar. And after they read, they really get into discussion of the text, that then they choose the topics that they want. And it's kind of getting personal with all of those issues. They have the authority to take on one theme and do the research, and it kind of takes on a life of its own. And it's beautiful to see that the students take the text as a point of departure to explain those larger issues, and like you saw in the morning, to really think about the dynamics that go beyond the text, beyond the country, and more about how is it interacting with other politics, whether it be gender, cultural politics, historical processes. And the research, it's a great part of that too. So again, project text is one of those that we leave at the end because it allows the students to incorporate the different skills that they have learned, the critical thinking, the research part, and then the writing also. culminates with the reading.
One thing that we did read in the second semester was Nobody's Son by Jose Alberto Urrea. And it's about, basically, it's like a kind of like personal narrative. And but then it's also contextualized within, it's a personal narrative, but it's a context, right? And so it was about him growing up in this, multi-ethnic family. His mother is Anglo-American, his father is Mexican-American. And growing up in El Paso in a working class community. And so there's like this bigger context for that life story. So that was one of the texts that we read. And students, again, loved that book because it was personal, but then it was also really, deeply contextual about all the politics of what's going on in the border.
I introduce students both to the library with a librarian, and we have a library day, which I feel is a great way of getting them introduced and in touch with how our library works. Our library has changed so much in such a short amount of time, so it's always good to continue to kind of update yourself and your students on what's going on, because things change from semester to semester.
Basically what I do is I call it the incremental version of research. That is, once I start progression 2, students begin to engage in research. It may be very minor in terms of, what has other people said about Toni Morrison's Beloved? And I would ask them specifically to look for those texts or research materials that tend to validate their position, maybe 5 of them or 4 of them, and then look for research materials that challenge their position. So I do this on those bases, and then by the time they get to progression 3, where we are in full argumentative mode, they understand the process of research itself. In addition to that, I send them to the library to get assistance with our librarians who, have classes and help students to select materials that are relevant to their topics. And I even give them a day off just to do that. And then they come back the next week with reports on what they found and how useful they were, So in a sense, it becomes a hands-on rather than just allow the students to go there, collect books and give you a bibliography that really makes no sense, The process for me is gradual.
One of the big things, we actually use the library quite a bit. And so we do Jenny's library orientation, where she gives students like the whole process to, finding texts, figuring out which ones you want to read, which ones you don't. I also talk to the students. Again, this is sort of stuff that I learned when I was at Michigan, that it was important to always sort of see yourself as a writer. So what I often do is I tell students stories about my own research and the perils and pitfalls of doing research as in the real world, right? That it's not always about just staying in the library. It's sometimes, especially with my research, it's like going out and talking to people and sort of figuring out. And so suddenly, like, students get really excited about, oh my gosh, I could include an interview with my, my grandfather, and I say yes. I think that's like legitimate.
SI is really fun. I run SI, so students who are in 113 will see my name, Ann Kellenberger, as the teacher of record on their classes, but happily for them, they will get access to other folks in the classroom. We have wonderful SI leaders who are advanced students who come recommended by teachers for their writing and their leadership skills. And in SI, they develop activities and other kind of hands-on learning methods to help students continue, expand, repeat, maybe reinforce some of the ideas or requirements or readings in their 113 classes. So for instance, if a student is got a new prompt, they can spend the time in SI brainstorming. Often students do their very first in-class presentations in 113, so SI becomes a great place to rehearse that. So it's a kind of mentoring experience for the 113 students and a fabulous also experience for the SI leaders to get to be mentors to students.
The Freshman Common Reading is a program that, I started about 7 years ago, and it's modeled after similar programs in place at campuses all over the country now. Each year, a 100% volunteer committee composed of faculty and staff and students, including both freshmen and ex-freshmen, which are sophomores, juniors, seniors, and the occasional graduate who just likes doing the committee. We meet, we read, we take nominations for the titles, and then vote twice, once to pick finalists, usually 5 finalists, and then a second time in January to pick the winning title for the coming fall. And the idea of the Freshman Common Reading is to welcome new freshmen in the fall with an intellectual experience that they can all share. Of course, they don't all read the book. It's not required in all their classes, but that's the goal. Some universities will ask their freshmen to read the Common Reading on their own at home in the summer before freshman year, but that didn't seem like the best model for Northridge. It's a lot more fun to work on the book here, and especially to have students reading it as they approach freshman convocation, which is usually the second or third week of the fall, and has almost always at CSUN featured the Common Reading author as the keynote speaker. A key thing for faculty to consider is how they can help students, not just in terms of course content, which obviously matters. We're here to teach, and it's an intellectual experience that the university provides. But faculty also should be aware that there's an emotional set of issues that freshmen are dealing with. Partly it's being in an unfamiliar place, partly it's dealing for the first time for many of them with expectations that they're going to behave as adults behave, and that's difficult. That's not a natural, instantaneous transformation that happens to somebody just because they got a high school diploma and set foot on a college campus. So that faculty, it's really asking a lot of faculty not only to teach subject matter, but also to teach students. That's one way to think of it. You're teaching your subject matter, but you're working with students to help them gain confidence and maybe some direction in why they're here, because not everyone comes to college knowing what they want to do. And even those who do believe they know, my major's business, that can change, and very often does change.
It's one of the things that I actually like to start off. I always sort of create this balance in my class where there's one day we're focusing on the mechanical aspects of writing, and then we have a day where we're focusing on the topics and the issues. I think that it's important, it is a writing class. And while you want to engage in conversation about the topics, you also have to remember that they need to learn all the writerly aspects, such as transitions and topic sentences or building a paragraph. So I introduce that right off the bat, and we do keep reviewing it throughout the semester.
I believe the most important aspect is the community that not only the students build with myself and the SI leaders, because I taught the 113 classes this year, but also what they build with their fellow classmates. They were able to do projects together. They were able to do projects separately. They did a lot of group work. When they peer edited, I always had them work with someone different. So I think one of the most important aspects is their opportunity to work and get to know with the other students and help to build their own community on campus. I feel that's really important, especially for first-year students who don't know anyone when they come on campus, or maybe know people from high school, but it gets them out of that comfort zone and it gets them to be comfortable in where they are, and I think that helps to achieve success for them.